Picture this. A grown woman soaking wet from head to toe mascara running down her face like war paint, standing in someone else's backyard at 7 in the morning screaming about assault while clutching a clipboard that's now nothing more than soggy pulp. That's exactly where Linda Bartholomew, the self-appointed HOA president of Oakwood Terrace, found herself on a cool September morning. And the homeowner whose property she'd been trespassing on? He was watching the whole thing unfold through his phone screen, sipping coffee in his kitchen, trying not to laugh out loud. But here's the thing that makes this story absolutely priceless. Linda had been warned. Multiple times. She'd been asked politely, then firmly, then through certified letters to stay off the property. Yet she kept coming back week after week, measuring grass height, inspecting fence posts, and photographing what she deemed violations of the HOA's increasingly absurd rules. She believed her position gave her unlimited access to everyone's private property. She was wrong. Dead wrong. What happened that morning wasn't just a simple case of someone getting wet. It was the culmination of 18 months of harassment, thousands of dollars in bogus fines, and one homeowner's decision that enough was finally enough. The motion-activated sprinkler wasn't just a deterrent. It became the catalyst for exposing an entire HOA's corrupt practices, illegal surveillance, and systematic harassment of residents who dared to question authority. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below because you are about to witness one of the most satisfying HOA takedowns ever recorded. And trust me, you'll want to share your own nightmare HOA stories after hearing this one. Marcus Chen moved into Oakwood Terrace in January of 2021, drawn by what seemed like the perfect suburban community. The neighborhood was beautiful. There was no denying that. Mature oak trees lined every street. The homes were well-maintained, and there was a sense of order that appealed to him after years of apartment living in the chaotic city center. He was a software engineer who worked remotely, which meant his home wasn't just where he lived, but also where he earned his living. Peace wasn't a luxury for Marcus. They were a necessity. The house he purchased was a modest 3-bedroom ranch, with a decent-sized backyard that backed up to a small wooded area, providing natural privacy. It was perfect for his needs. He had plans to set up a home office, build a small deck, and plant a vegetable garden. Simple, reasonable plans that any homeowner might have. The HOA documents he'd reviewed before closing seemed standard enough. Keep your lawn mowed, no loud parties after 10, no parking RVs in driveways, the usual suburban governance. Nothing in those documents prepared him for Linda Bartholomew. Linda had lived in Oakwood Terrace for nearly 20 years and had served as HOA president for the last 7. She hadn't been elected recently. She ran unopposed year after year because most residents couldn't be bothered with HOA politics. They paid their annual dues, followed the basic rules, and assumed everything was running smoothly. What they didn't realize was that Linda had gradually transformed her volunteer position into something resembling a fiefdom. She had rewritten bylaws without proper votes, instituted new rules through emergency measures that never expired, and assembled a board of 3 other residents who either feared her or benefited from staying in her good graces. Marcus's first interaction with Linda came during his 2nd week in the neighborhood. He was unloading groceries from his car when a silver Lexus SUV pulled up beside him. A woman in her late 50s emerged, dressed business casual despite it being a Saturday morning, carrying a leather folder that she held like a shield. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face, and her smile had the warmth of a corporate HR representative about to deliver bad news. She introduced herself as the HOA president and welcomed him to the neighborhood with the kind of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. Then came the pivot. She'd noticed that his garage door had been left open past 8 p.m. on 2 occasions. This was a violation of Section 7.3 of the Community Guidelines, which stated that garage doors should remain closed except during active use. Marcus was stunned. He'd been unpacking moving boxes and hadn't even thought about the garage door. It seemed like an absurdly petty thing to monitor, but Linda assured him she was doing her job, keeping the neighborhood looking its best. She handed him a printed warning notice, already filled out with his address and the dates of the violations. That should have been his first red flag, but Marcus was new and wanted to be a good neighbor. He apologized and promised to be more mindful. Linda's smile widened, and she told him she just knew he'd be a wonderful addition to the community. Then she asked if she could take a quick look at his backyard to ensure everything complied with the spring inspection. Marcus, caught off guard and still trying to be accommodating, agreed. What happened next would set the pattern for the next 18 months. Linda didn't just glance at the backyard. She walked the entire perimeter, taking photos with her phone, making notes on a pad, and measuring the height of the fence with a small tape measure she produced from her pocket. She pointed out that his fence was a 1/4 inch taller than the maximum allowed height of 6 feet. She noted that he had a small pile of landscaping stones near the back corner that would need to be removed or properly stored within 30 days. She mentioned that any vegetable garden he planted would need to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, which she chaired, and would need to be positioned. Hence, it wasn't visible from neighboring properties. Marcus listened with growing disbelief. He'd bought this house. He owned this property. Yet here was someone treating it like she had authority over every square inch. When he gently pushed back, mentioning that the previous owner had installed the fence and asking why he should be responsible for a 1/4 inch variance, Linda's demeanor shifted. The friendly welcome wagon act evaporated. She informed him, in a tone that brooked no argument, that as the current owner, all existing violations became his responsibility the moment he took possession. If he had issues with that, he was welcome to attend the monthly HOA meeting and present his concerns. Until then, he had 30 days to correct the violations or face fines of $50 per day. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't Marcus fight this from the start? Why not push back immediately? That's a fair question, and one that many people ask when they hear these stories. But here's the reality of HOA disputes. Most people move into these neighborhoods wanting peace, not war. They want to come home after work, relax, and enjoy their property. Getting into a legal battle with your HOA over a 1/4 inch fence variation seems ridiculous, exhausting, and potentially expensive. So most people, Marcus included, choose the path of least resistance. They comply with the small stuff, hoping that cooperation will buy them goodwill and freedom from harassment. What they don't realize is that with people like Linda, compliance isn't seen as cooperation. It's seen as submission. And submission only encourages more demands. Marcus corrected the fence issue by having a contractor shave off the excess height, costing him $300. He organized the landscaping materials. He submitted an architectural review application for a modest 10 by 12-foot vegetable garden in the back corner of his yard, complete with diagrams and photos of the planned aesthetic. The application fee was $75. He waited 6 weeks for a response. When it came, it was a denial. The reason given was vague, not in keeping with community aesthetic standards. He attended the next HOA meeting to appeal the decision. The meeting was held in Linda's living room, which should have been another red flag. 8 residents were present, most of them looking bored or intimidated. Linda sat at the head of a folding table with her 3 board members flanking her like lieutenants. When Marcus presented his case, explaining that the vegetable garden would be barely visible from any neighboring property, and showed photos demonstrating this, Linda listened with a tight smile. Then she explained that the board had reviewed his application thoroughly and the decision was final. Appeals could be submitted in writing within 10 days, subject to a $100 appeal fee. Marcus felt the frustration building, but kept his composure. He asked what specific aesthetic standards his garden violated. Linda shuffled through papers and cited Section 12.4 regarding organic structures and non-decorative plantings. Marcus asked to see Section 12.4. Linda told him all governing documents were available on the HOA website. When Marcus checked later that evening, Section 12.4 had been added to the bylaws just 3 months prior through what Linda had designated as an emergency aesthetic preservation measure. There had been no community vote, no notice to residents, just a unilateral decision by Linda and her board. But here's where things get interesting, and where you start to see the real pattern of Linda's behavior. Marcus wasn't the only one being targeted. As he started talking to neighbors, stories emerged. The family 3 houses down had been fined repeatedly for parking their second car on the street overnight, despite the fact that the bylaws only prohibited parking on streets during snow emergencies. Linda had decided that 2 cars in a driveway looked cluttered and started issuing fines. The elderly couple on the corner had been cited for their mailbox being off-white instead of pure white, necessitating a repaint. A young family had been denied permission to install a swing set in their backyard because it would be visible from the street when driving past at a certain angle. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Can you imagine living under this kind of scrutiny where every decision about your own property requires permission from someone who seems to delight in saying no? Marcus began documenting everything. Every interaction with Linda, every citation, every response. He joined a few online forums for HOA disputes and started learning about his rights. That's when he discovered that many of the rules Linda was enforcing weren't actually in the original HOA covenants. They were additions she'd made over the years, leveraging the fact that most residents didn't read the updates or attend meetings. He also learned that HOAs could only enter private property under specific circumstances, usually involving violations visible from the street or common areas, or with explicit permission from the homeowner. This became crucial information because of what happened next. Marcus installed security cameras around his property. 4 cameras cover the front, sides, and backyard. They were high-quality units with motion detection and cloud storage. His reasoning was simple. If Linda was going to cite him for violations, he wanted documentation of what was actually happening on his property. The cameras went live on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, they'd captured something remarkable. Linda had entered his backyard, not just once, but on all 3 days since the cameras had been active. She would park her SUV on the street, walk around the side of his house like she owned the place, and spend 15 to 20 minutes walking around his backyard, taking photos, measuring things, and making notes. She was doing this around 7 in the morning, when Marcus was usually in the shower or making breakfast. She'd been doing it before the cameras, too. He just hadn't known. This explained how she always seemed to know about violations he hadn't even noticed himself. She wasn't spotting them from the street or relying on neighbor reports. She was conducting personal inspections of his private property without permission. Marcus felt violated. This wasn't community governance. This was harassment. He reviewed his HOA documents carefully and confirmed what he'd suspected. Nowhere in the governing documents was there any provision allowing HOA officers to enter private property without permission, except in genuine emergencies involving safety hazards. Linda had no authority to do what she was doing. She was trespassing. He decided to handle it professionally. He compiled video footage showing Linda's 3 most recent trespassing incidents and sent a formal letter via certified mail to both Linda personally and to the HOA board. The letter was polite but firm. It pointed out that her entries onto his property were unauthorized, violated his privacy, and constituted trespassing under state law. It requested that all future inspections be conducted from public areas only, and that any need to access his property be communicated in advance with written permission obtained. He kept a copy of everything. The response came a week later, and it was not what Marcus expected. Instead of an apology or acknowledgement, he received a citation notice. He was being fined for installation of surveillance equipment without architectural approval. The fine was $500, with an additional $100 per week until the cameras were removed or properly approved. The architectural review application fee for security cameras was $200, and approval typically took 8 to 10 weeks. Now think about the audacity of this for a moment. Linda had been caught on camera trespassing repeatedly, and her response was to find the person who caught her. This is the kind of power abuse that makes HOA horror stories so infuriating. She was using her position to punish someone for documenting her illegal behavior. Marcus was done being polite. He responded with another letter, this time from an attorney he'd consulted. The letter detailed the trespassing violations, included still images from the security footage as evidence, and informed Linda and the board that the cameras were installed for security purposes and did not require HOA approval under state law, which superseded HOA rules. The letter demanded that the fines be rescinded and that Linda cease entering his property immediately. It stopped short of threatening legal action, but made clear that option was on the table. For about 2 weeks, things went quiet. The fines weren't rescinded, but Linda stopped sending new citations. Marcus allowed himself to hope that the message had gotten through. He should have known better. Linda wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. The next citation came via FedEx, overnight delivery, official-looking enough to be alarming. Marcus was being cited for unauthorized lawn modification and failure to maintain approved landscaping standards. The specific violation? He had allowed clover to grow in his lawn. According to a newly instituted weed management policy that had been added to the guidelines, all lawns must be maintained as pure turf grass, with no clover, dandelions, or other flowering plants that might attract bees. The fine was $250, with an additional $100 per week until the lawn was treated and the clover removed. Treatment must be performed by an HOA-approved lawn service, of which there were 2 approved providers. Both quoted him over $800 for the service. This was getting absurd. Clover was actually beneficial for lawns, provided nitrogen, and required less water than pure grass. Many modern landscaping experts recommend it for sustainable lawn care. But more importantly, the clover had been there when Marcus moved in. He hadn't planted it or modified anything. It had simply grown naturally. If this was a violation, it existed when he purchased the property and should have been disclosed. Marcus did some more digging and discovered something fascinating. One of the 2 HOA-approved lawn services was owned by Linda's son-in-law. This wasn't disclosed anywhere in the HOA documents. A member of the HOA board owned the other approved service. They had created a mandatory requirement for a service that funneled money to their own family members and associates. This wasn't just petty tyranny, it was a financial scheme. He started reaching out to other residents more seriously, forming a group of homeowners who had similar concerns about Linda's management. There were more than he'd initially realized, at least 15 families who had complaints ranging from questionable fines to outright harassment. But there was a problem. Most of them were afraid to speak up publicly. Linda had a history of escalating against anyone who challenged her. Residents who'd questioned her at meetings found themselves suddenly receiving multiple citations for minor violations. One family who'd filed a formal complaint with the board had been hit with over $4,000 in fines over the course of 6 months, eventually forcing them to sell their home and move. This is the insidious nature of HOA abuse. It's not always dramatic or immediately obvious. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Small fines that add up. Constant stress about whether your mailbox is the right shade of white or your grass is the approved height. The knowledge that someone with power over your property values and your peace of mind is looking for reasons to punish you. It grinds people down until compliance seems easier than resistance. But Marcus had reached his breaking point. The clover fine was sitting on his counter, unpaid. The security camera fine had never been rescinded and was now accumulating weekly penalties. He'd received a new citation for excessive noise because he'd been running a lawnmower at 9 a.m. on a Saturday, which Linda claimed violated the quiet enjoyment hours of before 10 a.m. on weekends. This despite the fact that lawn maintenance was required and most people mowed their lawns on weekend mornings. The contradictions in the rules were intentional. They gave Linda flexibility to enforce them selectively against anyone she wanted to target. So Marcus made a decision. If Linda was going to keep entering his property illegally, he was going to make it uncomfortable enough that she'd stop. He wasn't going to harm her or threaten her. He was going to enforce his property rights in a way she couldn't ignore. That's when he ordered the motion-activated sprinkler system, commercial grade, the kind used to deter deer and wildlife from gardens, high-pressure spray, instant activation when motion was detected, completely legal on his own property. He installed it himself, positioning it to cover the main path Linda used when she entered his backyard from the side yard. He set the activation zone carefully, ensuring it would only trigger for someone actually on his property, not on the public sidewalk or neighboring yards. Then he waited. He didn't tell Linda about it. He didn't put up warning signs. She'd been asked repeatedly to stop trespassing. She'd been warned in writing with evidence of her violations. She'd been informed by an attorney that her actions were illegal. At what point does a property owner have no obligation to provide additional warnings? Marcus figured he'd passed that point months ago. The cameras were still running, of course. They would capture whatever happened next. And Marcus had a feeling it would be something worth watching. Think about it for a moment. If someone kept breaking into your property after being told to stop, after being shown evidence of their trespassing, after being warned by lawyers, what would you do? Would you accept it? Or would you find a way to defend your space? The motion-activated sprinkler earned its keep on a Tuesday morning at approximately 7:15 a.m. Marcus was in his kitchen, making his usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, when his phone buzzed with a motion alert from his security system. He opened the app expecting to see a cat or maybe a delivery person. Instead, he saw Linda Bartholomew entering his backyard from the side yard, clipboard in hand, phone raised to take photos. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit, professional and pristine. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was it. Linda took about 4 steps into the backyard, moving toward his vegetable garden area that she'd denied approval for. She didn't get to take a 5th step. The sprinkler system detected her movement and activated with the kind of explosive force designed to startle deer. High-pressure water erupted from 3 angles, converging on her position with remarkable accuracy. The effect was instantaneous and comprehensive. Linda was drenched from head to toe in less than 2 seconds. The security footage captured everything in high definition. Her mouth opened in a shocked O of surprise. Her clipboard flew from her hands as she instinctively raised her arms to shield her face. Her phone, which she'd been holding up to photograph, nearly slipped from her grasp. The water kept coming, pulsing in rhythmic bursts designed to be as startling as possible. Linda tried to move backward but stumbled, her nice shoes slipping on the now wet grass. She caught herself before falling completely but went down on one knee. The water stopped after about 10 seconds of activation, as programmed, but the damage was done. Marcus watched through his phone screen, and he'd be lying if he said he didn't feel a surge of satisfaction. 18 months of harassment, thousands of dollars in bogus fines, constant stress, and violation of his privacy. And here was Linda, soaking wet in his backyard, exactly where she had no right to be. He took a sip of his coffee and watched as she struggled to her feet, mascara running down her face, her carefully styled hair now plastered against her head, her pantsuit clinging to her like she'd jumped in a pool fully clothed. What happened next elevated the situation from satisfying to absolutely priceless. Linda, instead of leaving immediately, started screaming. Not just yelling, but full-throated screaming about assault, about calling the police, about lawsuits and arrests. She pulled out her phone, which miraculously still worked despite the soaking, and actually called 911. Marcus could hear her from inside his house, her voice shrill and indignant, claiming she'd been attacked on someone's property and needed police assistance immediately. Marcus briefly considered going outside to explain the situation, but decided against it. Let the police come. Let them see the security footage. Let them hear about the months of trespassing that led to this moment. He saved the footage to multiple cloud locations and made sure he had copies of all the previous documentation. The certified letters warning Linda to stop trespassing, the attorney's letter, and the video evidence of her prior unauthorized entries. Everything is organized and ready. 2 police officers arrived within about 12 minutes. By that time, Linda had retreated to her SUV, which she'd parked on the street in front of Marcus's house. She'd wrapped herself in a blanket from her vehicle and was sitting in the driver's seat with the door open, looking like a drowned cat, but still radiating fury. The officers approached her first, and Marcus watched from his window as she gestured wildly, pointing at his house, clearly telling her version of events. After about 5 minutes, one of the officers walked up to Marcus's front door and knocked. Marcus opened it, greeted him politely, and invited him in. The officer, a middle-aged man with a professional demeanor, explained that there'd been a report of assault and asked for Marcus's side of the story. Marcus took a breath and launched into the explanation he'd been mentally preparing for months. He started with the context: the HOA harassment, the repeated trespassing, the certified letters, and the attorney's correspondence. He showed the officer documentation of everything, including the previous security footage of Linda entering his property without permission on multiple occasions. Then he showed the footage from that morning. The officer watched silently as Linda appeared on screen, clearly trespassing, and then got soaked by the sprinkler. When it ended, the officer asked if he could take copies of the footage. Marcus provided it immediately, along with copies of all the warning letters. The officer's expression had shifted from neutral investigation mode to something closer to suppressed amusement. He asked if Marcus had ever permitted Linda to be on his property. Marcus said no, absolutely not, and that he'd explicitly told her multiple times, in writing, to stop entering his property. The officer nodded and asked about the sprinkler system. Marcus explained it was a motion-activated deterrent system, completely legal, designed to protect his property from unwanted intrusions. He mentioned that it was commonly used for wildlife control and that he'd installed it specifically because previous requests for Linda to stop trespassing had been ignored. Here's where it gets really interesting, and where you can see how important documentation becomes in these situations. The officer asked if Marcus had any proof that Linda knew she wasn't supposed to be there. Marcus produced the certified mail receipts showing that Linda had signed for and received the letters warning her to cease trespassing. He showed the attorney's letter, which was even more explicit. The officer asked if there was any HOA rule or provision that gave Linda authority to enter the property. Marcus produced the HOA governing documents and pointed out the absence of any such provision. The officer excused himself and went back to speak with Linda. Marcus watched through his window as the conversation became animated. Linda was clearly not happy with whatever the officer was telling her. She kept pointing at Marcus's house, her voice rising even though Marcus couldn't make out the words. The officer remained calm but firm, his body language suggesting he wasn't buying whatever argument Linda was making. After about 10 minutes, the officer returned to Marcus's door. Here's what he said, and Marcus would remember this conversation for the rest of his life. "Sir, based on the evidence you've provided and Ms. Bartholomew's admission that she was on your property, I don't see any basis for assault charges. You have the right to install motion-activated systems on your own property, and you provided adequate warning to her to stop trespassing. If anything, she's the one who committed a crime by repeatedly entering your property without permission. I'm not going to arrest anyone today, but I've informed Ms. Bartholomew that if she continues to enter your property without permission, she could be charged with criminal trespassing. I'd recommend you consider getting a restraining order if this continues." Marcus thanked the officer and watched as both police vehicles departed. Linda sat in her SUV for another few minutes, presumably collecting herself, before finally driving away. Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Then he did what any reasonable person would do in the modern age. He posted about it on social media. Now, he didn't post the video publicly or use Linda's full name. He was smarter than that. But he did share the story in a neighborhood social media group and in one of the HOA reform forums he'd joined. He described what happened in general terms. The HOA president repeatedly trespassing despite warnings. The homeowner installs a motion-activated sprinkler. The trespasser gets soaked and calls the police, and the police side with the homeowner. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Other Oakwood Terrace residents started commenting, sharing their own stories of Linda's harassment. The 15 families Marcus had been in contact with privately now felt emboldened to speak publicly. Stories emerged of fines for violations that didn't exist in the official bylaws, of architectural review applications that disappeared or were denied without proper justification, of selective enforcement that targeted anyone who questioned Linda's authority. One resident revealed that Linda had been collecting HOA dues at a rate 20% higher than what was specified in the original covenant documents, pocketing the difference for years. Another discovered that the emergency measures Linda kept instituting required community votes according to state HOA law, votes that had never taken place. The story spread beyond just the neighborhood group. Someone shared it with a larger regional forum. Then it got picked up by a local HOA reform advocacy group that had been looking for clear examples of HOA abuse to highlight in their legislative campaigns. Within 48 hours, Marcus's sprinkler incident had become a minor internet sensation, shared thousands of times with comments ranging from support to amusement to outrage at HOA overreach. But Linda wasn't done. 2 days after the sprinkler incident, Marcus received a thick envelope via certified mail. Inside was a notice of emergency hearing before the HOA board regarding assault of an HOA officer, installation of hazardous equipment, and conduct unbecoming a community member. The hearing was scheduled for 5 days later. The notice stated that Marcus's behavior violated multiple community standards and that potential penalties included fines up to $5,000 and possible legal action to force the sale of his property for violation of community covenants. Can you believe the nerve? After getting caught trespassing, after having the police explain that she was the one who'd broken the law, Linda was doubling down. She was using her position to try to punish Marcus for defending his property. This is exactly the kind of retaliatory abuse that makes HOA horror stories so prevalent. Marcus immediately contacted the attorney who'd written the previous letter. They discussed options and decided that Marcus would attend the hearing, but would bring his own documentation and possibly legal representation. The attorney also suggested something else: inviting the media. The story had gotten enough attention online that a local news station's consumer advocacy reporter had reached out to Marcus asking for an interview. The attorney thought it would be wise to have the press present at the HOA meeting, putting public scrutiny on Linda's actions. The emergency hearing took place on a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, which was essentially just a room in a shared building with some folding tables and chairs. Marcus arrived to find it unexpectedly packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood, and at least 30 residents had shown up, far more than ever attended regular monthly meetings. The local news reporter was there with a camera operator. Marcus had printed copies of all his documentation and brought his laptop with the security footage queued up and ready. Linda sat at the front of the room with her 3 board members, and her expression when she saw the crowd and the camera was priceless. Pure shock mixed with barely concealed anger. She tried to start the meeting by asking the reporter to leave, claiming HOA meetings were private proceedings for residents only. The reporter politely informed her that under state law, HOA meetings were required to be open to all community members, and that, as a credentialed journalist covering a matter of public interest, she had every right to be present. Linda looked to her board members for support, but they seemed uncertain, probably realizing that ejecting a news crew would look terrible. The meeting began awkwardly. Linda tried to maintain her authoritative tone as she read the charges against Marcus: assault, hazardous equipment installation, and conduct violations. She described the sprinkler incident in the most dramatic terms possible, claiming she'd been violently attacked, that the water pressure could have caused injury, and that Marcus had installed a dangerous trap. She conveniently omitted the fact that she'd been trespassing at the time. When it was Marcus's turn to respond, he calmly presented his case. He showed the security footage of Linda's repeated trespassing incidents before the sprinkler incident. He displayed the certified letters warning her to stop. He read portions of the attorney's letter explicitly informing her that her actions were illegal. Then he showed the footage from the morning in question, where Linda was clearly on his property without permission when the sprinkler activated. Finally, he provided the police report and the officer's statement that Marcus had committed no crime and that Linda had been warned about criminal trespassing. The room was silent when he finished. Then one of the residents in attendance, a man named Robert, who'd been fined repeatedly for parking violations, stood up and asked Linda a direct question. Under what authority did she believe she could enter private property without permission? Linda stammered something about HOA inspection rights. Robert pressed further. Show me in the governing documents where it says that. Linda couldn't produce it because it didn't exist. What happened next was something Marcus hadn't planned but probably should have anticipated. The meeting turned into an impromptu referendum on Linda's entire tenure as HOA president. Resident after resident stood up and aired grievances. The woman who'd been forced to repaint her mailbox. The family denied permission for a swing set. The elderly couple was hit with excessive noise fines. The pattern was unmistakable. Linda had been abusing her position for years, using it to harass residents and enrich herself and her associates. Someone raised the issue of the lawn service kickback scheme. Someone else mentioned the inflated dues that had been collected without authorization. A third resident, who happened to be an attorney specializing in real estate law, stood up and explained that at least 6 of the emergency measures Linda had instituted over the years were legally invalid under state HOA statutes because they'd never been put to a community vote as required. Those measures, which included some of the most restrictive and frequently enforced rules, were essentially null and void. Any fines collected under those rules were subject to refund. Linda tried to regain control of the meeting multiple times, but the momentum had shifted completely. Her board members, sensing which way the wind was blowing, began to distance themselves from her. One of them actually said, "I was not aware of many of these issues and think we need to review our governance procedures." It was a betrayal, and Linda knew it. The meeting ended without any resolution on Marcus's case, because a different resident called for an immediate vote of no confidence in Linda's leadership. Linda tried to rule the motion out of order, but the real estate attorney stood up and cited the specific bylaw that allowed for such votes. It required a quorum of 20% of homeowners, which was easily met with the people in attendance. The vote happened right then and there. Of the 32 residents present, 29 voted in favor of removing Linda as HOA president. 2 voted against, and 1 abstained. It was the most lopsided vote anyone could remember in Oakwood Terrace's history. Linda sat in stunned silence for a moment, then gathered her papers and left the room without another word. The news camera captured her exit, mascara once again running down her face, though this time from tears rather than sprinkler water. It was over. Her reign as HOA tyrant had ended, brought down by a motion-activated sprinkler and a homeowner who'd had enough. Have you ever seen someone's entire power structure collapse in real time? It's satisfying in a way that's hard to describe, especially when that power was being abused for so long. The aftermath of Linda's removal unfolded over the following weeks and months, and it revealed just how deep the corruption had run. The new interim board, elected that same night from volunteers in attendance, immediately began an audit of HOA finances and governance. What they found was stunning even to those who'd suspected problems. Linda had been collecting HOA dues at $240 per year per household instead of the $200 specified in the covenant documents. With approximately 120 homes in Oakwood Terrace, this meant she'd been collecting an extra $4,800 annually. Over 7 years, assuming some variation in the exact number of homes, she'd likely collected at least $30,000 in unauthorized fees. The money had gone into the HOA's general account, but expenditures from that account told an interesting story. Large payments to her son-in-law's lawn service for community maintenance that had never been approved by the voters. Payments to a management company that turned out to be a shell corporation registered in her husband's name. Even the printing costs for all those citation notices she'd been so fond of sending were being charged to an office supply company owned by her sister. The architectural review fees that Marcus and others had paid, those were supposed to go toward administrative costs and community improvements. Instead, they'd been accumulating in a separate account that Linda controlled personally. Over 7 years, she'd collected approximately $35,000 in architectural review fees alone. Some of that had been used for legitimate purposes. Still, at least half had been spent on things that had no connection to community management. Dinners at expensive restaurants charged as board meetings, a trip to a resort in Arizona labeled as HOA management training, even personal shopping expenses that were somehow categorized as office supplies. This is what makes HOA abuse so insidious and so difficult to catch. It's not usually one massive theft. It's 1,000 small embezzlements, justified through creative accounting and enabled by the fact that most residents don't pay attention to the details of HOA finances. They pay their dues, trust that things are being managed properly, and don't think about it again until something goes wrong. Linda had been counting on that apathy, and it had worked for years until she pushed too hard against someone who fought back. The new board immediately suspended all outstanding fines pending a review of their legitimacy. Marcus's fines for the security cameras and the clover and the morning lawn mowing were all rescinded. So were dozens of other fines that had been issued under the invalid emergency measures Linda had instituted without proper votes. The board sent out letters to all residents informing them of the situation and offering refunds for any fines paid in the previous 2 years under the invalid rules. The total amount refunded exceeded $40,000. Marcus received a formal apology from the new board president, a retired teacher named Margaret who'd been living in the neighborhood for 12 years and had voted against Linda in the past, only to be targeted with harassment afterward. Margaret told Marcus that his willingness to stand up to Linda had given others the courage to do the same, and that the community was grateful. She also informed him that the board was implementing new governance procedures. All board meetings would be recorded and minutes published online within 48 hours. All financial statements would be made available quarterly to any resident who requested them, and any rule changes would require a community vote with at least 30 days' notice. But the story doesn't end with just Linda's removal and the financial corrections. The legal consequences for Linda were beginning to unfold. Several residents, emboldened by the audit findings and Marcus's successful defense of his property rights, filed a joint lawsuit against Linda personally for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. The lawsuit sought the return of all improperly collected fees, plus damages and legal costs. Marcus joined the lawsuit, adding claims for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress based on the 18 months of documented abuse. Linda tried to mount a defense, arguing that everything she'd done was within her authority as HOA president and that any financial irregularities were simple accounting errors. Her attorney, however, apparently saw the writing on the wall. The documentation was overwhelming. Years of unauthorized fee collections, payments to family members' businesses, personal expenses charged to the HOA, and rules enforced that had never been properly enacted. 3 months into the lawsuit, Linda's attorney negotiated a settlement. She agreed to repay approximately $65,000 to the HOA, covering the improperly collected dues, architectural fees, and questionable expenditures. She also agreed to resign from any HOA position permanently and signed a covenant not to run for any board position in the future. In exchange, the criminal fraud charges that the district attorney had been considering were dropped. The settlement didn't include any admission of wrongdoing on Linda's part, which frustrated some residents. But Margaret and the new board advised accepting it because it guaranteed financial recovery and removed Linda from power permanently without the risk and expense of a prolonged trial. Most residents agreed. They wanted their money back, and they wanted Linda gone. The settlement accomplished both. Linda and her husband moved out of Oakwood Terrace within 6 months. Word around the neighborhood was that they'd sold their house at a loss because they needed liquidity to cover the settlement payments. Marcus never saw her again after that night at the community meeting when she'd been voted out. Her silver Lexus SUV never returned to his street. The motion-activated sprinkler, which had started everything, remained installed for another few months before Marcus eventually removed it. It had served its purpose. Now, what happened with the media attention? The local news story aired 2 days after the community meeting where Linda was removed. It was a 5-minute segment on the evening news titled HOA Horror Story: How One Homeowner's Sprinkler Sparked a Revolution. The reporter interviewed Marcus, several other residents, and even managed to get a no comment from Linda as she was getting into her car. The story focused on HOA overreach and abuse of power, using Marcus's case as an example, but expanding to discuss the broader pattern of problems in Oakwood Terrace. The segment went viral locally, getting shared thousands of times on social media. It caught the attention of state legislators who'd been considering HOA reform legislation but hadn't had much momentum. One state senator actually reached out to Marcus and asked if he'd be willing to testify at a committee hearing about HOA governance issues. Marcus agreed, and 3 months later he found himself at the state capitol, telling his story to a room full of legislators and lobbyists. The legislation that eventually passed, partly inspired by cases like Marcus's, included several key reforms. HOAs would be required to maintain publicly accessible websites with all governing documents and financial statements. Any rule changes would require written notice to all residents at least 30 days in advance and would need approval by a vote of at least 30% of homeowners. HOA boards would be required to undergo training on their legal obligations and limitations, and most importantly, HOAs would be explicitly prohibited from entering private property without permission except in genuine emergencies involving immediate safety hazards, with violations subject to criminal trespassing charges. The law wasn't perfect, and it didn't solve all HOA problems, but it was a step forward, and it came about partly because one homeowner decided that enough was enough and defended his property with a motion-activated sprinkler. Let's talk about the broader impact on Oakwood Terrace itself. The neighborhood didn't fall apart without Linda's iron-fisted management, which is what she'd always claimed would happen if her strict enforcement wasn't maintained. In fact, the opposite occurred. With the oppressive atmosphere lifted, residents became more engaged in community governance. Attendance at HOA meetings went from typically 5 or 6 people to regularly having 30 or 40 participants. People felt like their voices mattered again, like they had an actual say in how their community was managed. The new board, under Margaret's leadership, took a completely different approach to governance. Instead of looking for violations to cite, they focused on genuine community improvements. They organized neighborhood cleanup days where residents volunteered together. They established a community garden in a shared space where people could actually grow vegetables, something that had been repeatedly denied under Linda's regime. They renegotiated contracts with service providers and discovered they could get better rates without the kickback schemes Linda had arranged, actually reducing annual dues by $20 per household while improving services. Property values in Oakwood Terrace, which had been stagnant for years, partly because of the neighborhood's reputation for HOA problems, began to increase. Real estate agents who'd previously warned buyers about the difficult HOA now actually mentioned the reformed governance as a selling point. Several homes that had been on the market for months sold within weeks once word spread about the changes. The community that had been defined by conflict and fear became known as an example of how HOA reform could work. Marcus's life returned to something resembling normalcy, though he'd become a minor celebrity in HOA reform circles. He received emails from homeowners across the country facing similar problems, asking for advice on how to fight back against abusive HOAs. He couldn't respond to everyone, but he tried to offer guidance where he could. His main advice was always the same: document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself when those rights are violated. The vegetable garden he'd wanted to plant from the beginning? He finally got approval for it under the new board, processed in less than a week with no fee required. He grew tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and herbs. He shared the produce with neighbors, including some who'd been afraid to speak up during Linda's reign, but thanked him privately afterward for having the courage to fight. Those conversations, more than anything else, made Marcus realize how much Linda's governance had damaged the sense of community. People had been living in fear in their own homes, afraid of their neighbors being Linda's spies, afraid of making any decision without checking the ever-changing rules first. One neighbor told Marcus a story that stuck with him. She'd wanted to paint her front door a different color, from white to a soft sage green. Under Linda's rules, this required architectural approval, a fee, and a community vote if any neighbor objected. She'd submitted the application, paid the $75 fee, and waited. Linda had held the application for weeks, then finally denied it, claiming the color wasn't within approved palettes. The neighbor had almost given up, but after Linda's removal, she resubmitted the application. It was approved in 3 days. When she thanked Marcus for making this possible, she had tears in her eyes. It was just a door color, but it represented something bigger: the ability to make decisions about her own home without harassment. Think about how profound that is. We're not talking about someone wanting to paint their house hot pink with orange polka dots. We're talking about a homeowner wanting to paint their front door a subtle, tasteful green and being denied that basic expression of personal choice. That's what HOA overreach looks like in practice. It's not always dramatic confrontations. It's the grinding away of small freedoms until people feel like they don't really own their homes at all. The financial recovery for Marcus, personally, was significant. Between the rescinded fines and his share of the settlement distribution, he recovered approximately $4,000 that he'd paid in bogus fees and fines over 18 months. That didn't include the time and stress, which can't be quantified with a dollar amount. But it did validate his decision to fight back rather than pay and comply. If he'd accepted Linda's authority and paid every fine without question, he'd be out that money, and Linda would still be in power, targeting him and others. The motion-activated sprinkler system that started everything cost Marcus about $250 to purchase and install. By that measure, it might be the best investment he ever made. Not just in financial terms, though. Getting back 16 times what he spent on the sprinkler is certainly nice. But more importantly, it freed him and his entire community from years of abuse. It gave people their homes back. It restored a sense of community that one person's need for control had poisoned. There's a broader lesson here about standing up to abuse. Whether it's in an HOA context or any other situation where someone is misusing power. The abuser relies on people being too intimidated, too tired, too busy, or too defeated to fight back. They count on the fact that most people will choose compliance over conflict, even when the compliance is unjust. And for a long time, that strategy works. People pay the fines, follow the absurd rules, and accept the harassment, because it seems easier than the alternative. But here's what Marcus's story demonstrates. Sometimes one person saying no is all it takes to break that cycle. Not everyone has to be a hero. Not everyone has to file lawsuits or testify before state legislatures. But someone has to be willing to document the abuse, to stand up at a meeting and ask uncomfortable questions, to install a sprinkler system and let the chips fall where they may. When one person does that, it creates permission for others to do the same. The 15 families Marcus had been talking to privately became 32 residents voting at a meeting. Those 32 became a community-wide movement for reform. Marcus still lives in Oakwood Terrace. His house, the one he bought with such optimism and saw become a source of stress and conflict, is now genuinely the peaceful home he'd originally wanted. He works from his home office without worrying about surprise citations. He tends his vegetable garden without fear of fines. He parks his car in his driveway and keeps his garage door open while unloading groceries, and doesn't think twice about it. These sound like small things, and they are. But they're also fundamental to what home ownership should mean. The security cameras are still installed, though Marcus doesn't check them nearly as often as he did during the conflict. They're there for actual security now, not to catch HOA presidents trespassing. Occasionally, he'll review footage if he hears something unusual outside, but mostly they just run in the background, recording and overwriting, a silent deterrent to anyone who might think about entering his property without permission. Margaret served as HOA president for 2 years after Linda's removal, then stepped down and helped orchestrate a genuinely democratic election for her replacement. The neighborhood now has term limits for board positions, 2-year maximum consecutive terms, ensuring that no one person can consolidate power the way Linda did. It's not a perfect system, but it's dramatically better than what existed before. And it exists because Marcus refused to accept that Linda's authority was unlimited. Here's something interesting that Marcus learned through this whole experience. Most HOA horror stories don't end with resolution. Most people who get crushed by abusive HOAs sell their homes and move, taking the loss and hoping their next neighborhood will be better. They don't fight back because fighting is exhausting and expensive, and there's no guarantee of winning. Marcus got lucky in some ways. He had documentation. He had the financial resources to hire an attorney when needed. He had the support of other residents once they saw someone was willing to fight. Not everyone has all those advantages, but he also made his own luck by being meticulous about documenting everything from early on, by educating himself about his legal rights, and by installing those security cameras that captured the evidence he needed. The sprinkler system was creative problem-solving, but the foundation of his successful resistance was built on less dramatic actions, saving emails, taking photos, keeping receipts, reading the governing documents carefully, and attending meetings even when it was boring and frustrating. There's a practical guide hidden in Marcus's story for anyone dealing with HOA problems. First, read your governing documents thoroughly. Know what rules actually exist versus what the HOA board claims exist. Second, document everything. Every interaction, every citation, every fine. Dates, times, exact wording. Third, communicate in writing whenever possible. Emails and certified letters create paper trails that casual conversations don't. Fourth, know your state laws regarding HOAs. Many states have regulations that supersede HOA rules, but most residents don't know what those protections are. Fifth, find allies. You're not the only one being targeted or frustrated. Build coalitions with other residents. And finally, be willing to draw a line. Know what you're willing to accept and what you're not, and be prepared to defend that line. Marcus's line was his property boundary. When Linda kept crossing it despite repeated warnings, he defended it with a sprinkler system. Your line might be something else, but having one and being willing to defend it is crucial. Otherwise, the abuse will continue indefinitely because there's no reason for it to stop. The story of the motion-activated sprinkler spread far beyond Oakwood Terrace. It became a folktale in HOA reform communities, a David versus Goliath story where the little guy won. Marcus received interview requests from podcasts, blogs, and even a cable news segment about property rights. He did a few of them, always emphasizing that his case wasn't unique. The details were his own, but the pattern of HOA abuse was common. Thousands of communities across the country had their own versions of Linda Bartholomew, petty tyrants who turned volunteer governance positions into personal fiefdoms. Some people criticized Marcus's approach, arguing that the sprinkler was a prank or a trap, that he should have continued pursuing legal channels instead. Marcus's response was always the same. He had pursued legal channels. He'd sent certified letters. He'd hired an attorney. He'd filed complaints. And Linda had ignored all of it because she believed her position made her untouchable. The sprinkler wasn't his first response. It was his last resort after every reasonable option had been exhausted. And it worked precisely because it was dramatic enough to force a confrontation that couldn't be ignored. There's something to be said for creative resistance. Sometimes the system is so broken or so captured by the abuser that working within it is futile. The HOA board was Linda's board, chosen by her or cowed by her. Filing complaints with that board was pointless. The legal system moves slowly and expensively, and Linda could drag things out indefinitely while continuing to pile on fines. But a sprinkler. That created an immediate crisis that forced everyone, including the police and eventually the media and the community, to pay attention and take sides. It cut through all the bureaucratic nonsense and created a moment of clarity where everyone could see exactly what was happening. Marcus didn't set out to become an advocate for HOA reform. He just wanted to live peacefully in his house and grow some vegetables in his backyard. But sometimes ordinary people get thrust into extraordinary situations simply because they refuse to accept injustice. They don't think of themselves as heroes or activists. They're just individuals who reached a breaking point and decided to push back. And occasionally that act of individual resistance creates ripples that become waves that create real change. The legislation that was passed in Marcus's state has become a model for other states considering HOA reform. At least 4 other states have introduced similar bills, citing the Oakwood Terrace case as an example of why such reforms are necessary. Will those bills pass? Some might not. But the conversation is happening in ways it wasn't before. People are questioning whether HOAs, as currently structured, serve homeowners or create another layer of bureaucracy ripe for abuse. That questioning is valuable even if immediate legislative change doesn't follow. For Marcus, personally, the experience changed how he thinks about community and governance. He's more engaged now, not just in HOA matters, but in local politics generally. He attends city council meetings occasionally, votes in every election, including the small local ones most people ignore, and stays informed about issues affecting his community. The HOA battle taught him that governance matters, that the people making decisions about rules and enforcement have a real impact on daily life, and that citizen engagement is the only check on the abuse of power. He's also more aware of the importance of documentation and legal literacy. He keeps better records of everything now, not just HOA-related matters, but financial documents, correspondence, and contracts. He reads the fine print. He asks questions when something doesn't make sense. These are habits that will serve him well throughout his life, born from a situation where inadequate documentation could have cost him his case. The sprinkler itself, the physical device that triggered everything, Marcus eventually donated to a community theater group that was doing a production involving a garden scene. They were thrilled to have a working motion-activated sprinkler for authenticity. Marcus figured it had earned its place in community theater history. Every time it activates on stage, he imagines Linda's face that morning, and he smiles. Some people ask Marcus if he has any regrets about how things played out. Would he have done anything differently? His answer is nuanced. He wishes the conflict hadn't been necessary at all. He wishes Linda had accepted his initial polite requests to stop trespassing and had governed the HOA fairly from the beginning. He wishes he hadn't had to spend 18 months stressed and angry, spending time and money fighting battles that shouldn't have needed to be fought. In an ideal world, none of it would have happened. But given that it did happen, given that Linda was who she was, and the situation was what it was, Marcus doesn't regret his actions. He did what he needed to do to defend his property and his rights. He followed the law, exhausted reasonable options, and then got creative when those options failed. The outcome, the exposure of corruption, and the reform of his HOA benefited not just him, but his entire community. Could he have achieved the same result through different means? Maybe. But it's hard to see how. The traditional approaches had all failed. Sometimes unconventional solutions are necessary for unconventional problems. The motion-activated sprinkler was unconventional, no doubt about that. But it was legal. It was targeted at someone who was breaking the law, and it created a catalyst for change that might not have happened otherwise. If nothing else, it made for one heck of a story, the kind people tell when they're sharing their own HOA nightmares and looking for hope that resistance is possible. So what's the ultimate takeaway from Marcus Chen's battle with HOA Karen Linda Bartholomew? It could be this: your home is your castle, and you have the right to defend it, not with violence, not with harassment, but with creativity, documentation, legal knowledge, and the courage to stand up when someone tries to take away your fundamental rights as a property owner. HOAs exist to serve communities, not to rule them. When they forget that distinction, when they become vehicles for petty tyrants to exercise power over their neighbors, they need to be challenged. Marcus challenged his HOA, and he won. His community is better for it. The laws in his state are stronger because of it. And somewhere, someone reading this story who's facing their own HOA nightmare might find the courage to fight back, to document their case, to stand up at a meeting, or even to install their own metaphorical sprinkler system. Because at the end of the day, that's what this story is really about. It's not about a sprinkler system or even about one particular HOA tyrant. It's about the fundamental human need to feel safe and sovereign in your own home, to make decisions about your property without fear of harassment, and to live under rules that are fair, transparent, and justly enforced. When those conditions don't exist, when power is abused and rights are trampled, someone has to stand up and say enough. Marcus was the someone for Oakwood Terrace. Who will it be in your community? The sprinkler is just waiting to be activated. The question is, are you ready to install it?